Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into a topic that's far more intricate and perilous than you might expect. Not the tales of philosophers or kings, but the curious world of dating in the Middle Ages. Believe it or not, trying to find love amidst plagues, dowries, and watchful chaperones was somehow even more awkward than sending a late night, "What you doing?" text at 2 a.m. From the lofty courtly love ballads to marriages brokered through livestock trade, medieval romance was less about butterflies in the stomach and far more about securing land rights and forging alliances. So before we get comfy, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I bring to the table here. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see the global reach and diverse time zones of our audience. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for a gentle background hum, and let's gently ease our way into this captivating journey together. Imagine you're standing in a bustling medieval village, or perhaps inside a stone-cold castle, wondering how to go about finding love. Maybe you try to start a conversation, compliment someone's hose, or ask, "Do you come here often?" Well, forget all that. None of this modern flirting applies. Dating as we understand it simply doesn't exist in medieval times. Instead, your family, whether your parents, your lord, or even your abbot, has probably already decided who you'll marry, when, and exactly how many cows or other livestock will be exchanged to seal the arrangement. If you belong to the nobility, chances are you've been betrothed since well before your voice even dropped. You might meet your future spouse for the very first time on your wedding day. An experience as awkward as it sounds. Everything centers on consolidating land, titles, and alliances between powerful families, not on romantic compatibility or shared interests like aiming loot raids. For peasants, it's only marginally less formal. Their families still play a major role in arranging matches. Love isn't part of the conversation. More likely, your parents will think about a girl whose family owns a productive goat herd, or a boy who's skilled at roofing without tumbling off. And just like that, you're courting. Make no mistake, medieval people definitely felt romantic emotions, but those feelings took a back seat to survival, inheritance, and then maintaining social order. Falling in love before marriage was risky. Falling in love outside of marriage? That was downright scandalous. Such acts were socially frowned upon. Unless you happened to be a character in a tragic poem, then all bets were off. Nonetheless, dreams and secret hopes flourished. Maybe you penned a few lines of verse on a scrap of parchment, or stole a lingering look from across the crowded market. Perhaps, just maybe, you found yourself falling for someone your family's livestock negotiator hadn't approved. But for now, patience was a virtue. You obeyed, you waited, and did your best not to develop feelings for the miller's apprentice. Because in this world, love was the pursuit of poets, but marriage was the serious business of parents, priests, and politics. So when you see someone cute, perhaps it's the way they effortlessly balance a basket of onions on their head, or the confident way they beat the mud out of a rug. Your medieval heart just might skip a beat. But steady it, for this world demands restraint. Imagine a world where romance doesn't simply blossom on feelings and sparks. Instead, it's all about tangible assets and solid commitments. Before you even think about courting someone, the very first question you should ask yourself is, what do I truly bring to the table? If your answer is something as intangible as a charming personality, you might want to reconsider your approach. For young men, the stakes are clear. You need something concrete. Land, livestock, tools, or at least a sturdy roof that won't collapse in the next rainstorm. While love letters might seem romantic, they hardly make you husband material. Nothing impresses quite like owning 2 healthy oxen, or a shelter that can survive a mild storm. And if your father has already promised the finest goat to your brother, well, it might be time to consider an entirely different path. Perhaps even the priesthood. For young women, the situation is just as pragmatic. Their families must provide a dowry, whether that means coins, fine clothing, or an oddly generous batch of geese. Wit and charm will get you nowhere if your family can't pay up. Without a sufficient dowry, you might find yourself spending long days perfecting embroidery by yourself, waiting for an opportunity that might never come. Now, picture this. You actually find someone whose presence makes your heart race. Perhaps your eyes meet by the town well. The air fills with intrigue and romance. It's poetic. But alas, unless both your families stand on similar financial ground, that romantic encounter is as fleeting and intangible as a passing cloud. And if you happen to be noble, things are even more complicated. Your marriage isn't just a union of two people. It's a political contract involving lands, borders, and alliances. In essence, you become a living, breathing treaty. Even peasants are not immune to such practical concerns. Marriage there is less about butterflies and more about shared resources. A pig pen adjoining a wheat field, negotiations over irrigation rights. What you might dream about passion for, you ultimately settle for practical considerations. Still, despite all this, people try. Maybe you offer a carved spoon, a handful of berries, or your best mug, perhaps a little cracked, and wait for a smile in response. But beneath it all remains the hard truth. In medieval dating, economics shapes flirtation, and love is merely the hoped-for bonus your spouse might develop someday. Now, if you're not a peasant fretting over livestock boundaries or a noble juggling political alliances, but instead a knight clad in shining armor, what kind of love life awaits you? Welcome to the curious, emotionally demanding world of courtly love. But be clear, this isn't about dating. It's performance, a noble pastime mixing flirtation, spiritual suffering, and utter impracticality. In this arena, a gallant knight selects a noble lady, often one who's already wed, and pledges his devotion from afar. Not physically, because that would spoil the entire illusion, but emotionally enduring elegant suffering. You may pen anguished verses celebrating her silvery laugh, or the fiery shine of her hair, medieval compliments that essentially mean she has hair and hasn't insulted your family. You wear her colors proudly in tournaments, pine for her, sigh deeply, and perhaps joust a rival who dares to glance too long at your beloved. As for the lady, her role is equally demanding. She's expected to appear subtly flattered by your devotion, but maintain an icy detachment capable of chilling even glaciers. Her response might be a letter, a token, or a ribbon, but mostly, she remains mysterious and unattainable. This air of distance, this unattainability, is the entire essence of courtly love, a theatrical dance of desire, sacrifice, and social convention woven into the fabric of medieval life. The emotions run high, yet physical contact remains scarce. At best, you might receive a simple nod from across the hall or a fleeting brush of a finger against your gauntlet during a lavish feast. Anything beyond that? Suddenly, it's not courtly love. It's scandalous, or worse, adultery. And officially, nobody desires that. This entire arrangement functioned best when all parties involved understood. It was largely a charade. It was a way to express longing, devotion, and creative frustration without upending the social hierarchy. A medieval form of emotional release, if you will. Was it dramatic? Without a doubt. Did it rely more on poetry than practicality? Constantly. But in a world caught between battles and bouts of tedium, courtly love offered something to write about, and someone to inspire those writings. Just don't expect a happy ending, a passionate kiss, or even prolonged eye contact. So you've fallen for someone wonderful. Now comes the challenge. How to express that affection in a society where touching another's hand without a chaperone is basically a declaration of hostility. Welcome to the medieval solution. Tokens. Think of them as 12th century texts, slow, cryptic, and wildly prone to misinterpretation. Imagine you are a knight hopelessly in love with Lady Marjorie, whose surname escapes you. You cannot speak to her alone, and your carefully crafted poems keep getting intercepted by her confessor. What do? You send her a glove or perhaps an embroidered sleeve. Nothing conveys I love you quite like mailing off a piece of your clothing. If you're on the receiving end, congratulations, you now possess a sweaty linen sleeve you didn't ask for, along with the daunting task of interpreting its meaning. Is he confessing love? Requesting a favor? Hinting at a jewel? Who can tell? Women gave tokens too. Ribbons, strands of hair, tiny pendants. Tokens were sentimental, yes, but also strategically significant. Giving the wrong token to the wrong man meant you might find yourself claimed by someone with a wandering eye and a fondness for drink. Tokens were meant to be subtle. A glove pinned discreetly to your chest, a ribbon tied to the hilt of a sword. Everyone understood the message without it ever being spoken. A shared secret. The crisper, the mystery, the better. It was less about clear communication and more about plausible deniability. This glove? Oh, it's not from Lady Joan. It just appeared on my pillow, scented with lavender, completely random, really. For common folk, tokens were simpler. Maybe a wooden carving or a handkerchief stitched during slow moments between chores like milking cows. It was still romantic, but with the added touch of calluses. Yet tokens were risky. Offering one to the wrong recipient could ignite rumors. Receiving an unwanted token meant delicately figuring out how to return, say, a sock, without offending someone's noble lineage. In spite of the awkwardness, these tokens bore genuine emotional weight. They symbolized love in a world that left very little room to openly express it. At last, you gather the courage to approach your crush. Perhaps you offer a flower? Maybe you recite a bit of awkward poetry. Poems you definitely didn't steal from a troubadour. This is the medieval dance of affection. Slow, laden with symbolism, filled with hope and hesitation. Imagine you're a traveling minstrel, poised for a tender moment. But there's a catch. You're never truly alone. Welcome to medieval dating, a world where love is far from blind. It's under constant surveillance by your mother, the parish priest, a watchful cousin, or sometimes all three simultaneously. Picture yourself as a young woman of marrying age. Every movement is scrutinized. You're not just taking a stroll. You're walking alongside Margaret, accompanied by her intimidatingly strict aunt, who's already assessing your posture with a critical eye. Even a simple errand, like fetching water, is never free from watchful eyes. Someone is always observing. This isn't romance. It's more like espionage. For men trying to win a lady's heart, securing permission isn't optional. You need the blessing of her family, her priest, and the local grapevine. You arrive with flowers, only to find her father sharpening his blade behind the door. Her mother pretending to stir a pot that sat cold for hours, and the village priest passing by on his way to evening prayers, conveniently appearing at just the right moment. The reasoning behind this strict oversight was straightforward. Safeguard virtue, uphold family honor, and absolutely forbid any unsanctioned contact, especially before marriage, especially alone, and especially ever. Chaperones were the guardians of innocence, ensuring interactions were monitored, group outings, walks supervised, even sitting on the same bench only if someone's grandmother was knitting nearby while feigning ignorance. The church played a dominant role, acting much like a nightclub bouncer, controlling who could mingle and how. Priests preached sermons on proper behavior, and penned extensive treatises warning against the perils of flirtation. Yes, entire medieval manuals existed, berating flirtatious conduct. Imagine scribes painstakingly copying those by candlelight, while monks silently judge from across the scriptorium. Even writing letters was risky business. Some monasteries would open and inspect love letters, screening them for any moral impropriety. It was divine censorship at its finest. So, if love found you, you had to learn to pursue it quietly, under the watchful eyes of your entire extended family, and perhaps under the gaze of God himself. Now, envision yourself consumed by medieval love, mostly yearning, confusion, and pacing anxiously by windows. You catch each other's glance across a crowded feast. Perhaps they picked up your dropped handkerchief without tossing it into the fire. The tension is nearly unbearable, yet free conversation remains forbidden. Mothers, priests, and chaperones stand like emotional border guards. What's left to do? Write a letter. Ah, the secret love letter. The most perilous piece of parchment since an excommunication decree. Here lies your chance to bare your soul, but not with plain words. Instead of saying I like you, you must declare, my soul is a stag pierced by the arrow of your grace, roaming the forests of yearning. Provided you are literate, a rare gift, you compose your confession on vellum or rough parchment, pouring your heart into cryptic, poetic lines, risking everything to find a connection in a world that forbids it. If you're truly committed to making your message special, you might dust it with flower petals or a hint of perfume. But handle that with care. One noble once mistakenly used a love letter to wrap a herring and ended up delivering it to the wrong lady. Funny enough, they're married now, so all's well that ends well. Then comes the tricky part. Delivering your secret missive. You can't just hand it over straightforwardly. Instead, you need a courier. A loyal servant, a bribed monk, or even a younger sibling who might not fully grasp the consequences. Occasionally, a minstrel could be enlisted, singing your poem aloud in the town square, pretending it's an anonymous, subtle, and daring piece of art. However, this approach was very risky. The line between heartfelt romance and outright heresy was thinner than among patients during Lent. If your metaphor hinted even slightly at anything physical, you might find yourself confessing to both lust and literary exaggeration. Yet, despite all these restrictions, people still wrote. Some letters survived time's ravages, and some poems were copied and passed around like forbidden fruit. In a world governed by strict rules and constant surveillance, a folded scrap of words felt revolutionary. So, you write. You risk it all, your trembling hand pressing ink to parchment, saying everything you dare not voice aloud. But don't sign it too clearly. You want romance, not a summons to a church trial. Then, finally, comes a reprieve. The feast day, the harvest festival, the maple dance, those rare moments when life isn't just about work, prayer, and hiding secret feelings for the blacksmith's daughter. Today, you're allowed, sort of, to flirt, as long as no one sees, or everyone sees but pretends not to. Welcome to medieval festivals, where romance blooms beneath the watchful eyes of all your neighbors and the local chickens. Festivals were among the few socially acceptable occasions for men and women to mingle, laugh, and dare to make eye contact. There's music, ale, and someone sporting a flower crown with an air of daring confidence. You've never seen so many people shedding their usual gloom. If you're a peasant, you might try to catch your love's attention by winning the sack race, grabbing a greased pig, or juggling 3 stale rolls. Nothing says, I'm single, quite like gracefully falling off a hay bale. Dancing was often the best chance for real contact. Though rules were strict, a well-timed spin or a casually grazing hand could speak volumes beyond any poem. Take the maple dance, for instance. Essentially a giant excuse for coordinated flirting wrapped up in ribbons and plausible deniability. For nobles, flirting at a festival meant less roughhousing and more poetry. You might craft a verse on the spot, comparing your lady's eyes to twin candles or other glowing delights, and offer a trinket, hopefully one not plainly made by your servant just minutes earlier. Sharing food was also a tactic. Offer your beloved a meat pie, or share a honey cake. Acceptance with a smile meant you were on the right track. Handing it to their dog meant it was time to move on. But remember, you are always being watched. A parent, a priest, a bard with a big mouth, or someone else in the crowd might catch every move you make. Imagine stepping into a world where a single innocent smile sparks gossip that echoes through the village church for 6 weeks straight. Yet, for just a few fleeting hours, you get to live in a bubble. A place where love isn't about bargains, laughter isn't met with suspicion, and dancing in the town square doesn't lead to a stern rebuke. You're not a shining knight, a wealthy noble, or a bard laden with treasures and overflowing emotions. Instead, picture yourself as an ordinary villager, waking with the cows, settling down with the chickens at night, and spending countless hours trudging through muddy fields. Your search isn't for a poetic soulmate, but someone practical, someone who can milk a goat without stirring up emotional chaos. Welcome to the realm of peasant courtship, where romance boils down to practicality. Here, grand gestures are scarce, and true chemistry means you can endure the harsh winter side by side. Dating isn't about deep, lingering conversations. It's more about shared labor and mutual respect. You notice someone because they sweat diligently in the sun, grumble little, and happen to have a decent set of teeth. That's your entire checklist. No fireworks, just realism. You want a partner who can gut a fish efficiently, and it maybe doesn't snore so loudly that the chickens flee. So, how do you express affection in this world? Through modest, useful gifts. A basket of fresh eggs, a carefully bundled sheaf of firewood, or a crisp turnip from your garden. Feeling adventurous? A hand-woven ribbon or a spoon you carved painstakingly by candlelight, with your pig silently judging your handiwork, speaks louder than grand declarations. Conversations bloom amidst shared chores. Walking together to the mill, chatting while herding sheep, or swapping nods during some less than pleasant task. No sonnets exchanged here. Only talk of weather changes, crop yields, and tales of old Tomius falling into the well once again. Yet, within this simple routine, a different kind of romance unfolds. There's beauty in humility and strength in cooperation. You learn one another's strengths and weaknesses, like who's fastest when a goat breaks free. Proposals come swiftly. If both agree and the families consent, marriage follows. Maybe you move into an existing hut, or build a new one with the village's help. You bring your cherished blanket. Your partner brings a sturdy goat. Together you embark on the remarkable journey of domestic survival. A life far removed from glamour but rooted firmly in honesty and shared effort. Finding someone who can cook, clean, put up with your relatives, and doesn't flinch at the sight of your muddy feet. That's true love in this reality. And then comes marriage, which in medieval times is far from a romantic vow beneath the stars. Instead, it's a binding contract, often negotiated with the same enthusiasm as a livestock auction. Even for peasants, it's a monumental event, a gathering of witnesses, a local priest fumbling through Latin phrases, and underneath the sanctified blessings lies a businesslike checklist. Dowry land rights, ownership of cattle, and contingency plans for the hardships of farming seasons past. Ah, yes. Romance in the medieval village, rough around the edges, but real and enduring. If you hail from the upper class, prepare yourself, because marriage isn't just about love or companionship. It's a full-scale legal negotiation. Your parents, their parents, the priest, the scribe, maybe even a cousin who once dabbled in law, are all involved. Often the bride and groom stand more like decorative pieces, merely nodding when addressed. Sometimes you may not even have met the person you're set to marry. Your family has already done the arithmetic. Your estate needs the fields she brings, her dowry offsets your debts, and your coats of arms snap together perfectly. Love? Love? That's optional. The union? Absolutely mandatory and, once sealed, permanent. Divorce? Practically non-existent, unless you can prove that someone wasn't baptized, or there was a secret blood relation, or in rare cases, that a spouse died and failed to mention it. Annulments did exist, but they required piles of paperwork, a stroke of luck, and a hefty bribe. Yet, it's not all grim. Some couples genuinely grew to love each other. Through shared chores, the trials of raising children and surviving harsh winters, affection, or at the very least, tolerance, sprouted. And in medieval terms, tolerance was nearly synonymous with love. The church played a central role in these unions. Marriage was a holy sacrament, one of the 7 major ones, and not merely a legal contract. You didn't just wed for property or status. You married because God was meant to be a witness. Sometimes, too, you'd stand together, exchange vows, and smile politely as someone handed over a sack of onions, declaring it a blessing. Now, imagine you've had quite enough. Enough contracts, enough negotiations, enough being treated like prized cargo. You're noble, yes, but for once you want to marry solely for love, not for land, lineage, or your father's grand plans. Congratulations, you're about to spark a scandal. Noble elopements were the medieval equivalent of setting your family tree ablaze and dancing in the ashes. Choosing your own partner wasn't just a personal rebellion. It was political sabotage. Picture Lady Elelena, promised a way to secure a powerful estate, but she's fallen head over heels for a penniless squire who smells faintly of horses and adventure. They meet in secret, whisper sweet nothings in the stables, and one day she disappears, off to a monastery where the abbot owes her a favor. There, she marries under questionable legality, witnessed only by a trembling monk and a couple of chickens. Back home, chaos erupts. Her family is outraged. Her father threatens to besiege the groom's family garden. Her mother weeps into her embroidery hoop. The church is deeply concerned, and the gossip, deliciously rampant. If you're the groom in this romantic rebellion, don't get too comfortable. Best case, you keep your bride and your kneecaps. Worst case, you face excommunication followed by a not-so-pleasant disembowelment. Still, some couples manage to get away with it. If undoing the union would cause more embarrassment, families sometimes sighed, grudgingly accepting the new status quo. After all, what's done is done. And at least no one ended up dead. Hopefully. In rare cases, these scandals, they became legends, figures immortalized through songs, poems, and whispered tales at grand banquets. These were 2 nobles who chose love over duty, almost mythical in their defiance. It's true that most noble marriages were calculated transactions, not romantic fairy tales. Yet, in the brief moments of rebellion, those passionate escapes, secret vows murmured beneath moonlit towers, love fought to survive against all odds. These fleeting acts reminded everyone that love, despite all the obstacles, refused to disappear. So, if you ever feel melodramatic about swiping left on a dating app or turning down a second date, remember this. At least your love life doesn't involve clandestine weddings, enraged barons, or a horse tethered to a ladder outside your window. Ah, marriage. The beautiful merging of 2 souls and their corresponding financial assets. In the Middle Ages, love was sweet, but a dowry, now that was the true symbol of romance. Imagine you're a bride in this era. You're not merely getting married. You're being launched like a small economic vessel equipped with a dowry. Your family painstakingly prepares this dowry, which includes money, livestock, land, fine linens, perhaps a cow or two if they think highly of you, and on generous days, even a set of pewter dishes. These gifts go to your future husband, who receives you and your portable wealth with open arms and a calculating mind. Flip the scenario to some cultures or regions where the exchange works differently. Instead of the bride's family giving, it's the groom who pays a bride price. The groom presents gifts, maybe a horse, a fine cloak, and 3 pigs, in exchange for the honor of marrying her, essentially declaring, "Here's my offer. Now give me your daughter." This is medieval romance in full display. The crucial point? Someone always pays someone. Marriages came with receipts. These transactions were far more than about wealth. They symbolized status, expectations, and public declarations. A generous dowry could signify a prestigious lineage, while a sparse one might hint at a family eager to marry their daughter off quickly, perhaps due to troublesome traits or a sharp tongue. As a bride, you rarely retained control over your dowry. It became part of your husband's household economy, overseen by him, protected by law, and hopefully not squandered on dice games or ale in the first month of marriage. If your marriage ended, by death, annulment, or your husband's midlife quest for a monastery, the dowry could theoretically be returned. But reclaiming it was notoriously difficult. It required support, legal knowledge, and someone who could read. On the other hand, the bride price was akin to purchasing a rare goat, costly upfront and non-refundable. It compensated the bride's family for the labor she would no longer provide. After all, who else would milk the sheep now? In short, while love sometimes appeared at the altar, money was always present. Perhaps marriage wasn't your path. Maybe you were a second son. Your dowry suspiciously small. Or you simply loved chanting prayers more than committing vows. In that case, you joined a monastery or convent. Congratulations. You vowed poverty, chastity, and embraced a life defined by discipline and devotion. Picture yourself in a stone cloister, immersed in silence and the faint scent of candle smoke, caught in the unexpectedly soulful eyes of Brother Anselm. Despite the rigid walls of the monastery, love, forbidden though it was, managed to find its quiet refuge here. Let's be clear. Falling in love within a religious order was highly discouraged. Some might say punishable by whipping, exile, or a stern lecture delivered in Latin. After all, you took solemn vows to surrender your heart entirely to God, which meant there was no room left for anyone else. Yet, hearts have their own stubborn will. And sometimes prayers start to sound eerily like love poems. Perhaps it began with innocent encounters, passing each other bread in the refectory, sharing whispers during vespers, laughing just a bit too heartily when a hymn faltered. Before long, you might find yourself discreetly slipping extra cheese into Sister Beatrice's satchel, wondering if these feelings are something more. Monks and nuns often penned passionate letters, cleverly disguised as theological reflections. Your soul is a shining light in the darkness of my contemplation. That sounds devout, until you read between the lines. Of course, such romances were often shrouded in secrecy. There were scandals, clandestine meetings amid the herb gardens, confession sessions that stretched beyond the sacramental, and, on occasion, the heart-stopping discovery of a nun with an inexplicably rounded belly. The consequences were severe: exile, public penance, or being sent away to some remote abbey famous only for sheep and silence. But not all tales ended in disgrace. Some lovers managed to escape and even wed after being defrocked. Yet most returned to their cloisters, cheeks flushed with embarrassment, rededicating themselves, and insisting the whole episode had been nothing more than an overzealous theological debate. Because ultimately, monastic life was about discipline. Still, even in robes and silence, humans remain human. Sometimes a simple, quiet glance across the chapel stirred more excitement than any grand tournament or courtly poem. Now, imagine you did leave the cloister to marry. There was a priest, a pig roast, and of course, someone accidentally spilled mead on your mother's only fine cloak. Months or years pass, and suddenly something feels amiss. Maybe your spouse snores like a dying beast, or perhaps they conveniently omitted mentioning a secret gambling addiction. Or maybe you've just realized that marrying for land and sheep doesn't guarantee romantic bliss. Welcome to the world of medieval marital disappointment. Don't reach for divorce papers. They don't exist, at least not in any form you'd recognize. Marriage was a sacred, unbreakable bond, blessed by the church, sealed by God, and maintained by public shame. Annulments were possible, but required very compelling reasons. We don't get along simply wouldn't suffice. To annul a marriage, you'd need to prove one party was underage, already married, too closely related, a surprisingly common issue, or best of all, that the marriage was never consummated. A fact that had to be confirmed in writing, possibly under oath. Good luck with that. For nobles, the situation became even more tangled, because marriage wasn't merely personal, it was profoundly political. In medieval times, attempting to escape a marriage could spark a feud, ignite a scandal, or even trigger a small war. Often, it was safer to quietly harbor resentment, attend separate feasts, and avoid open conflict. So, what did unhappy couples do? Mostly, they endured their circumstances. They slept in different beds, sighed heavily at dinner, and channeled their emotions into embroidery or somber psalms. Passive aggression effectively became their unique language of love. Affairs did occur, sometimes kept discreet, other times quite dramatic. Nobles had their secret lovers, while peasants often had neighbors whose kindness aroused suspicion. The church strongly condemned adultery, but that only made people craftier at sneaking around barns and blaming such escapades on God's inscrutable will. For women, escaping a bad marriage was incredibly difficult. Even if their husbands were violent or had disappeared, society expected them to remain loyal, silent, and mildly pious, often subsisting on little more than bread crusts and relentless disapproval. Still, some managed to navigate these hardships and make their marriages work. Though marriages were rarely joyful, they could become bonds strengthened by adversity, habit, and shared experiences like hauling firewood in the rain. Now, consider when a spouse dies, perhaps from the plague, a farm accident, or even tripping over a goose in the dark. Suddenly, the status of widowhood opens a surprising window back into the medieval dating world. Being a widow during that era was strangely liberating. Not freedom of absolute choice, but certainly more autonomy than before. Women especially often experienced newfound independence, managing land, making decisions, and even speaking publicly without being immediately hushed. If you were relatively young and still in good health, remarriage could happen very quickly. Although there were culturally observed mourning periods, survival instincts often took precedence. A widow with land and no husband was basically a walking treasure chest, attracting suitors swiftly. Some sincere, others simply very interested in acquiring dairy cows. Men who were recently widowed also faced societal pressure to remarry promptly. After all, who else would cook, clean, and raise the numerous children they had somehow accumulated? Consequently, widowers began searching for new partners, perhaps the baker's daughter or a quiet widow who brought excellent mead to market. Romance and second marriages sometimes blossomed surprisingly sweetly. Older and wiser, these individuals weren't being forced into strategic alliances. Rather, they selected partners to survive with, maybe even someone they genuinely like. Quite a fresh idea for the time. However, rules existed. The church frowned upon quick remarriages. Jumping back into wedlock before the deceased spouse's body grew cold was seen as improper. Widows often had to negotiate dowries and inheritance issues with family members. Few things a romantic second chance quite like heated disputes with your brother-in-law over who keeps the butter churn. Still, second marriages were both common and expected. Life was short, winters were harsh, and no one wanted to endure them alone if they could avoid it. And, yes, love played a role. Perhaps not the kind of swooning sonnet-writing passion, but a quiet, enduring companionship born from shared resilience and mutual support. In the medieval world, love was not simply a matter of feeling. It was woven with shared stories, mutual respect, and the understanding that both people had weathered trials before. So you light the fire, pour the soup, and try again, not because the situation is perfect, but because it is human. You have journeyed far, surviving contracts, courtships, chaperones, and maybe even a dramatic barn elopement. But before you surrender your heart to someone new, ask yourself the most ancient and medieval question. Are you cosmically allowed to love this person? Because back then, love was not just a matter of the heart. It was a matter of stars, bones, and even whether your grandmother had seen a fox that morning. Let's start with astrology. Yes, before sharing a single kiss, you might want to consult the local monk-turned-astrologer. Are your zodiac signs compatible? Is Venus in retrograde? Was your beloved born under an unlucky moon? If so, it was wiser to choose a less cursed partner. After all, love is challenging enough without planetary sabotage. Then came the birthmarks, mysterious little symbols thought to reveal whether someone was your soulmate's lost twin or their destined executioner. Medieval superstitions were flexible that way. The church enforced its own strict rules too. Marrying a cousin, or even a second cousin or a fourth cousin twice removed, was forbidden unless you obtained special permission, which the wealthy often purchased through loopholes. Before relationships grew serious, you might find yourself drawing a family tree and quietly erasing inconvenient branches. Social status held immense sway as well. A noble falling in love with a peasant was either considered a miracle or a moral failing. Cross-class romances were rare and scandalous, acceptable only if they became tragic folk songs later. Then there were omens to read. If a raven flew overhead while you thought of someone, that was a bad sign. Dropping bread at dinner while glancing at your crush. Forget it. That union was cursed. Protective charms might be buried under your doorstep to ward off unsuitable suitors, or, conversely, to sabotage your chances with the right one. Either way, the mystical realms interfered heavily. Love in this world wasn't just a private affair. It was a mystical web involving stars, saints, weather, and that suspicious woman living deep in the woods who everyone agreed wasn't a witch, though she almost certainly was. Yet despite all the rules, signs, and hushed warnings, people loved clumsily and bravely, often defying all advice. Because medieval or not, the heart remains wonderfully disobedient. You've likely heard of Alexander the Great or Julius Caesar. But have you ever heard of the woman who reportedly beheaded Cyrus the Great and dunked his head in blood? Her name was Tomius. She didn't rule from gilded thrones or fortified cities. Instead, her court stretched beneath the open sky. Her army rode the winds, and her power stemmed not from titles, but from sheer, unshakable authority. She was queen of the Mace, a confederation of nomadic tribes roaming the vast steppes of Central Asia. Picture fearless horse archers adorned with tattoos, engaging in ritual feasts and delivering battlefield justice. Tomius embodied a form of raw power, entirely unlike the settled kingdoms we commonly know. Tomius wasn't born into power through privilege or a pampered court. She earned her position through sheer determination, strong leadership, and a fierce "don't mess with me" spirit. Her people were tough, accustomed to brutal winters, long migrations, and being surrounded by threats on all sides. Yet even among such hardy folk, Tomius stood apart. She was not just a queen, but a warrior, a lawmaker, and a sovereign who ruled by her own right. No husband ever overshadowed her authority, nor did a brother dictate her decisions. To be clear, much of what we know about Tomius comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, a man whose tales blend fact and legend without rigorous fact-checking. But if only a portion of his stories hold true, then Tomius was no ordinary monarch. She was a tempest incarnate. At the core of her tale lies the rise of a foreign superpower, the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. Cyrus had already conquered wealthy Lydia and mighty Babylon. Now his ambition took him eastward. The Massagetae, Tomius people, were next on his conquest list. However, Cyrus underestimated the formidable leader he faced. Long before the clash of arrows or the shattering of spears, before the death of her son shifted the tides forever, Tomius was already preparing for war, not out of desire for expansion, but out of sheer refusal to bend. She wasn't simply defending land. She was protecting her people's way of life. And as Cyrus was soon to discover, some queens are invincible barriers. No conqueror breaks. Cyrus the Great was no ordinary king. He was a conqueror's conqueror, a man who marched into ancient cities, toppled empires, and yet earned admiration from historians centuries later. So when he cast eyes east toward the Massagetae, he didn't anticipate much defiance. After all, he'd taken Babylon with ease. Who could stand against such power? Initially, Cyrus extended a diplomatic hand with a proposal, a political marriage, to Tomius. While it might sound romantic, Tomius saw through the veil instantly. It wasn't about love or an alliance. It was about domination. Agreeing to marry Cyrus would reduce her kingdom to a mere Persian province, and herself to a trophy queen. She declined the offer decisively. Cyrus, unused to being refused, did not take this well. If he couldn't win her over with charm, he would seize her lands by force. Crossing the Araxes River, which marked the frontier between his empire and the Massagetae, he entrenched his forces on their soil. But Tomius was no passive victim. Gathering her warriors, consulting her chiefs, she braced for the impending war she knew was inevitable. Then came the trap. Under the advice of his general Harpagus, Cyrus set a clever snare. Leaving a part of his army behind, they established a camp overflowing with luxuries, fine wine and lavish food, rare indulgences for nomadic peoples like the Massagetae. Tomius' son, Spargapeses, led a contingent to investigate. They pillaged the camp, seized the supplies, and, tragically, consumed the wine. At precisely that moment, the Persians returned, catching the Massagetae warriors in a drunken and disorganized state, completely unprepared for the assault that followed. Sparapises and his men were overwhelmed in the heat of battle. Captured alive, Sparapises became a prisoner under Persian hands. When Tomius received the devastating news, her world shattered completely. This was far more than a military defeat. It was profoundly personal. Her son, her only heir, was now at the mercy of the enemy. Determined, she sent a stern message directly to Cyrus: "Return my son and leave my land. Should you refuse, I swear by the sun, the master of the massage, I will make you taste blood like never before." Cyrus, however, ignored her warning. Overcome with shame for his capture, Sparapises took his own life while in Persian custody. Now, Tomius had lost her only son and stood on the brink of a furious reckoning. Grief alone is powerful, but grief fused with unyielding fury. This was the deadly concoction fueling her resolve. when she learned of her son Sparapi's tragic suicide. Something inside her broke irreparably. This was no longer a mere matter of defending borders, pride, or independence. This was war drenched in cold vengeance, and Tomius was no woman to mourn silently in the shadows. She did not retreat to her tent clad in mourning robes nor doze beside flickering fires. Instead, she mounted her horse with grim purpose, sharpened her weapons, and took an oath that would be remembered through the ages. She vowed to face Cyrus in battle, to defeat him on the field, and to make certain his name would forever carry the weight of her wrath, even in death. According to the historian Herodotus, Tomius called her tribal council to arms. Under her decisive command, the Massagetae mobilized in full force. Imagine hundreds of fierce warriors riding horseback, clad in tough leather armor, wielding bows and spears, their faces painted to embody wrath and focus. Unlike the disciplined Persian legions, they moved like a raging storm, swift, wild, and striking with deadly precision. This time, Tomius was the hunter. She baited the trap, knowing Cyrus might be blinded by overconfidence after his previous deception. Her keen insight into his tactics allowed her to await the perfect moment with steady patience before unleashing the full might of her forces. What followed was, as Herodotus recounts, one of the bloodiest battles known to the ancient world. There were no elaborate formations or stirring speeches, only the roar of galloping horses, the clash of steel, and a queen who fought side by side with her warriors. There was no delicate, silken empress here. Tomius was in the thick of combat, charging fiercely, cutting down foes with relentless precision. When the dust finally settled, it was Cyrus the Great who lay dead on the battlefield. True to her theatrical sense of justice, Tomius ordered his body examined. His head was severed, placed inside a wineskin filled with blood, and presented as a final grim offering. Herodotus reports that she spoke to the severed head, "You thirsted for blood. Now, drink your fill." Whether every detail unfolded exactly as told is almost irrelevant, for the essence of the story matters most. Tomius had triumphed. She shattered the greatest empire of her time, avenged her son's death, and ensured that her name would be remembered not as that of a victim, but as a mighty conqueror. And this victory was merely the dawn of her enduring legend. The battlefield grew cold and silent. The Persian forces were either dead or scattered in retreat. Their legendary king lay lifeless in the dust. And Tomius, she did not instead celebrate like a vain conqueror. There was no grand parade through Pepilolis, no carving of her visage onto minted coins. She simply stood, silent and resolute, over Cyrus' fallen body. Her vengeance fulfilled, she paused. Her war far from over, but her resolve now etched into the annals of history. Her heart remained shattered, despite the victory. Triumph, as it turned out, did not bring the solace she sought. The Massagetae had claimed more than just a single battle. They had decisively shifted the course of an empire's destiny. The news of Cyrus the Great's death reverberated like thunder throughout the ancient world. From the bustling streets of Babylon to the grand monuments of Egypt, and across the expanses of the Persian realm, whispers spread. The seemingly invincible king had fallen, not at the hands of a rival empire, but by a fierce nomadic queen. She had no grand throne, no magnificent palace, only unrelenting fury, unyielding grit, and a cavalry of warriors who would have charged into the very depths of hell for her. Yet, remarkably, Tomius did not leverage this stunning victory to pursue conquest. Instead, she returned to her people with the same grounded pragmatism that defined her rule. There were no war taxes imposed, no dreams of imperial expansion entertained. She did not attempt to claim the Persian throne, for that was not her ambition or her world. Her quest for justice was complete. Her son had been avenged. The empire might endure without Cyrus, but from that day forward it would think twice before venturing eastward again. Consider how extraordinary this was. After such a monumental triumph, most rulers would have seized power with relentless determination. Yet, Tomius appeared more concerned with safeguarding her people's freedom than expanding her dominion. And then, as suddenly as she emerged into history, her story begins to fade. There are no known records about her following the battle. No statues glorifying her. No royal tomb commemorating her life. No inscriptions praising her deeds. Like the vast steppes she once roamed, she slips into the mist of history, elusive and untamed. Historians have long debated the accuracy of Herodotus's account. Some argue that Cyrus met his end elsewhere, suggesting that the tale of the blood-filled wineskin was more poetic than factual. Yet even the skeptics concede that Persia suffered a staggering defeat, one delivered not by a king or general, but by a queen, a mother propelled by immense love and fierce vengeance. Her story did not require etching in stone. It lived on, carried by the wind. Locals say that when the wind howls across the steppes, it still whispers her name. To truly understand Tomius, one must first grasp the essence of the people she led. The Massachei were unlike the traditional ancient civilizations known for marble temples, hanging gardens, or scrolls of poetry. They were a nomadic warrior society inhabiting the vast, untamed lands east of the Caspian Sea, worlds so wild and remote that Persian governors and Babylonian scribes barely knew of them. Their existence revolved around constant movement, survival, and an unwavering code of honor. Picture endless plains without borders, where horses and cattle were the measure of wealth, and warriors were nurtured from infancy to live and fight atop steeds. Children learned to ride before they could even walk steadily. Archery was no mere pastime. It was instinctive and essential. Their weaponry reflected their lifestyle. Compact, lethal bows and armor crafted from layered leather and scales, designed to be flexible enough for mounting yet robust for battle. They hunted, raided, and fought tirelessly to protect their freedom. Unlike many male-dominated societies of the era, Massachei women were warriors in their own right. This was not an extraordinary exception. It was the norm. These women fought alongside the men as a matter of course, not legend. So when Tomius lifted her sword and led her people into combat, it raised no eyebrows. She was not disguising herself as a man, or fulfilling a rare role. She was simply a leader, a warrior queen, embodying the spirit and strength of her people. Tomius wasn't just a woman defying the norms of her time. She was the very embodiment of her people's ideals, only sharper, smarter, and far more formidable than most. In her society, strength was highly valued, but it was tempered with a deep sense of justice. Crimes were punished swiftly and harshly, yet fairness was always maintained. Property was often communal, emphasizing the importance of loyalty to the tribe and the ability to defend it above all else. Kings and queens did rule, but their power came not from tyranny or bloodline alone. They governed through consensus and had to earn their leadership through notable deeds rather than inherited titles. Their religion centered on sun worship. Tomius famously swore by the sun in her warning to Cyrus, acknowledging the sun as the master of the message, a symbol of life, light, and ultimate justice, acting as the divine arbiter of all oaths. To break one's word was to insult the heavens themselves. In essence, Tomius was no oddity or anomaly. She was precisely what the Masag, a fierce and proud people, revered in a leader. Her rise to power was not despite her gender, but because she perfectly embodied the qualities they honored. Unlike the Persians, whose empire was steeped in bureaucracy, the Masag prized freedom above all else. And in one brutal, history-defining confrontation, that freedom stood unyielding. Coming from a land where relentless winds howled freely, and the sky stretched endlessly overhead, submission simply wasn't an option for them. Now, here's the twist. Everything we know about Tomius, her epic battle with Cyrus, the tragic death of her son, even the gruesome detail of a wineskin brimming with blood, comes solely from one man, Herodotus. Often celebrated as the father of history, he's also, somewhat less flatteringly, known as the father of hearsay, myth, and dramatic embellishment. He had a real flair for storytelling and loved weaving tales involving divine omens, bloody revenge, and queens plunging heads into blood-soaked vessels. So how much of Tomius's story is fact, and how much is artistic license? That largely depends on how much trust you place in a Greek historian writing decades after the events, likely never having met a Masag person firsthand. Herodotus pieced together his narrative from second-hand reports, traveler stories, and the swirling rumors of the vast Persian Empire. To him, history was not merely a record of events. It was a theatrical performance. But here's what truly matters. Amidst a world dominated by male warlords, despots, and kings, Herodotus chose to highlight a steppe queen, an extraordinary woman who toppled one of history's greatest rulers. That's significant. Zooming out, why did this story spread so far and wide? Because it contained every element of an unforgettable legend. A noble woman, a fallen son, a cunning adversary, a battle to the death, and a finale drenched in blood worthy of the finest Greek tragedy. If you lived in Athens or Rhodes and heard this tale recited by a traveling bard, Tomius' name would be etched into your memory, not merely because she wore a crown, but because she dared to challenge a superpower and emerged victorious. Over the centuries, her story evolved and transformed. Medieval chroniclers painted her as a savage Amazon. Renaissance artists depicted her soaked in blood, triumphantly holding Cyrus' severed head like a trophy. She became an exotic, fearsome icon. Yet through all these retellings, something undeniably real persists in her legend. Not necessarily the exact words spoken or the gruesome details, but the core bones of the story. A queen, the loss of her son, a relentless war, and an unforgettable victory. It might seem that the story of Tomius is too detailed, too vivid, almost too human, to be mere fabrication. Yet, what Herodotus did was not just to record her existence. He elevated her into legend. This act may blur the boundaries between fact and fiction, but it also guaranteed that her name would endure far beyond the official decrees of Cyrus's empire. History tends to forget the names of generals, but it remembers stories of vengeance. For a queen whose physical monuments have vanished, Tomius has haunted the imaginations of empires for over 2 millennia. During the Renaissance, artists found her story irresistible. She became a dramatic muse, embodying the violent climax fit for grand canvases. In 1622, Peter Paul Rubens painted her serene yet formidable, holding a severed head while witnesses looked on with awe. In another striking portrayal, she remains regal and composed as Cyrus's decapitated head is ceremoniously immersed into a golden bowl overflowing with blood. Are these images tasteful? Perhaps not, but they are undeniably memorable. To European painters, Tomius was far more than a mere historical figure. She was the embodiment of symbolism, a woman who punished arrogance, a fierce noble, a cautionary myth, or even a feminist icon, depending on the artist's perspective. She could symbolize a mother's righteous wrath, the wildness of the East, or the shrewdness of a ruler who refused to be bribed. Writers were equally captivated by her. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, she featured prominently in plays, novels, and philosophical essays. Enlightenment thinkers debated whether she proved women could rule wisely or served as a warning against emotions driving leadership. Regardless, her story remained in circulation. Curiously, the Massagetae, her own people, left no written records of her. Over time, the Massag disappeared from history, absorbed or erased by successive nomadic groups. Unlike other rulers, no inscribed monuments or ornate burial sites proclaiming Tomius was here exist. Her memory survives solely through outsider accounts. Yet, she persisted. During the Soviet era in Central Asia, Tomius was reclaimed as a potent symbol of resistance against imperialism. Statues honoring her appeared in Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan. Modern historians reassessed her role, not as a bloodthirsty barbarian, but as a legitimate sovereign. A woman who commanded armies, led people, and negotiated from positions of strength. Her legacy has permeated various media, from documentaries to video games. In one moment, she is a playable leader strategizing on the screen. In the next, she is a subject of scholarly analysis on gender and power. That's an extraordinary spectrum. And here's a striking fact. Despite all this cultural presence, we still have no idea what she truly looked like. No coins, no statues, no reliefs depict her likeness. What endures is what she symbolized: strength, vengeance, autonomy, and legacy. In a world prone to forget queens who conform, Tomius is remembered precisely because she defied expectations. She never sought to fit quietly into history's gallery. Rather, she burst through the door and posed boldly for the most violent portrait ever painted. Tomius was not the first woman to lead warriors into battle, nor would she be the last. Yet history often paints women like her as exceptions, isolated flashes of power in a dominantly male-dominated world. The truth is far richer. Tomius belonged to a long, often overlooked tradition of women who wielded the sword and ruled with authority. But let's take a step back and start from the beginning. Let's talk about Tomius and her counterparts throughout history. One remarkable figure was Shamaramut, the Assyrian queen who might have inspired the legendary Semiramis, known as a city builder and a fierce slayer of rebels. Around that same period, the Scythians, relatives of the Massagetei, had female warriors buried alongside their weapons. Their skeletons show unmistakable signs of battle wounds. These women weren't just symbolic warriors. They fought fiercely, shed blood, and died in combat on horseback. After Tomius came more women who defied expectations. Consider Boudica, the Celtic queen of the 1st century CE, who led a fiery rebellion against the Roman Empire. Much like Tomius, her war was fueled by personal tragedy. Her daughters were brutalized and her lands were taken. Her response was brutal and decisive. She razed Roman settlements to the ground. The parallels between their stories are striking. Grief, desire for vengeance, and an empire blind to the threat right in front of it. Then there's Zenobia, queen of Palmyra, in the 3rd century CE, who boldly defied Rome and carved out a mini-empire of her own in the east. She went so far as to mint coins bearing her image, declared independence, and forced the Roman emperor to acknowledge her power. What connects all these women, including Tomius, is not merely their authority but their unparalleled audacity. They led in times when leadership was assumed to be a male-only domain, wielding power not as caretakers or placeholders, but as cunning strategists, fierce generals, and sovereign rulers. Despite their victories, many male leaders were celebrated for their conquests, but these women were often branded as dangerous, unnatural, or savage. Why? Because they won. Tomius was never a solitary phenomenon. She was part of a millennia-long, global pattern of women rising during crises and making kings bleed. Her story, preserved through Greek writings and modern imagination, reminds us that female leadership was not rare. It was simply infrequently recorded. So, the next time you picture ancient warfare, don't just imagine helmets and beards. Envision a queen riding horseback, bow in hand, fury blazing in her eyes. Understand that Tomius was not alone. She was one of the few whose story survived the tide of history. Tomius never built grand palaces, left behind golden inscriptions, nor created lasting dynasties. No majestic tomb, no preserved armor, No marble busts displayed in a museum carry her image. Yet, remarkably, she endures. Her legacy is paradoxical. It rests on only a few paragraphs by Herodotus, a source that was biased, perhaps exaggerated, and even partly fictional. Still, these words planted a seed that refused to die. Over more than 2,000 years, her name has resurfaced countless times during moments when the world needed to remember that power doesn't always wear a crown or a beard. Throughout the centuries, she has been reimagined in various ways. To Renaissance Europe, she was the noble savage, a cautionary warning to tyrants. In modern Central Asia, she emerged as a folk hero, a symbol of resistance and national pride, particularly in nations grappling with colonial and imperial legacies. Statues of her rise proudly in Kazakhstani plazas. Children memorize her name in school textbooks. Politicians invoke her when speaking of strength and independence. But beyond the myths and symbols, there's a profoundly human story here. It's about a mother grieving the loss of her son. It's about a leader who, despite overwhelming odds, rose up to challenge empires and defy expectations. Tomius' tale isn't just history. It's a powerful reminder of resilience and courage through the ages. Imagine being faced with a choice between surrender and survival. This is the story of a person who, when trapped by one of the most formidable powers the world has ever known, chose to fight back and emerged victorious. In a world that often forgets the names of warrior women, Tomius endures like a hidden blade just beneath the surface, always ready to be uncovered by a new generation eager for tales of fierce defiance. She reminds us that history is not merely about kings and vast empires. It also encompasses mothers and queens, sorrow and vengeance, earth and blood. It's found in the quiet moments after battle when a lone woman stands in a field scattered with fallen warriors, aware she has altered the course of history but will never be fully acknowledged. Perhaps her greatest legacy is her unwavering determination to remain unforgettable. No statues, no problem. Her name still rides on the wind across the steppes. Her story still humbles emperors, revealing their mortality. And her legend continues to whisper a stark warning. Come after me, and you will taste a river of blood. So the next time you hear the tale of a great king's downfall, remember, sometimes the decisive strike comes not from a rival empire, but from a queen on horseback, lost to history yet never truly gone. Now, picture a life where your walls are made of felt, your roof is stitched from animal hides, and your front door opens directly onto the endless horizon. No cities, no sprawling farmlands, no towering stone monuments to pass down to future generations. Just the steady rhythm of hooves, the whisper of tall grass, and a sky in constant flux. For the ancient nomadic cultures, permanence was an illusion. Mobility was their true strength. From the vast Eurasian steppes to the sweeping Arabian deserts, these nomads shaped entire civilizations without leaving behind a single marble temple. These were not aimless wanderers but strategic movers, guided by the changing seasons, the grazing routes of their herds, and an intimate knowledge of the terrain. Their homes, yurts, tents, or wheeled wagons, were foldable fortresses designed for life on the move. Cattle, sheep, goats, and above all, horses formed the backbone of nomadic livelihood. Wealth was measured in livestock, not in land ownership. Horses were so much more than mere tools. They were companions, weapons, and symbols of status. To master riding was to survive. To excel was to rule. But nomadic life wasn't about chaos or disorganization. These societies had intricate social structures. Power often coursed through clans and tribes, with leadership earned through merit and influence rather than rigid heredity. A chief or khan might rise through tactical brilliance, persuasive speech, or sheer charisma. Loyalty was personal, won around campfire councils, and on wind-swept battlefields. Far from isolated, these nomads were the connective threads of the ancient world. They transported silk from China, spices from India, silver from Persia, and slaves from Europe. Nomadic caravans and traders served as the original transcontinental couriers long before empires recognized their importance. When trade faltered, they didn't hesitate to raid. Swift, strategic, and terrifyingly efficient. Their history was not etched in stone but sung, recited, and passed down through generations by word of mouth. Throughout generations, elders carried the torch of their people's legends and laws, passing them down orally with reverence. Within these traditions, a tribe's entire legal framework, their history, and very identity could live inside the memory of just one bard or elder. These stories were never mere entertainment. They served as lessons in governance, codes of conduct, and the foundation of identity itself. To great empires, nomads often appeared unpredictable, foreign, and dangerous forces. Yet to themselves, they were the steadfast guardians of freedom, masters of adaptation, and heirs to the restless wind itself. Though they left behind few permanent structures, they altered the world profoundly with every journey and every horse they rode. Long before the mighty Mongol hordes thundered across Eurasia, the Saiyans reigned supreme over the vast windswept steppes. From the 9th century BCE through the 2nd century BCE, these fierce nomadic warriors commanded the lands stretching from the Black Sea all the way into the far edges of Central Asia. To the Greeks, they were formidable horsemen and exotic barbarians, fearsome in battle. But to the Saiyans, they were a people defined by freedom, bound by vengeance and pride. Their entire society was constructed around movement and warfare. Their horse culture surpassed all others. Young boys mastered horseback riding even before they could walk steadily on foot. Their weaponry was perfectly suited for their mobile fighting style. Short composite bows designed for shooting accurately while galloping full speed, curved swords, battle axes, and iron-tipped spears. The Scythian warrior was not solely male. Archaeological evidence supports what the historian Herodotus suggested. Women too picked up arms and fought. Excavations have uncovered female skeletons interred with weapons, their bones showing wounds only possible from real combat. They built no cities, yet their cairns, large burial mounds, have preserved their rich legacy. Beneath these ancient tumuli, archaeologists have discovered magnificent gold artifacts, tattoos preserved on human skin, finely embroidered garments, and intricately crafted weapons. Their distinctive art style, featuring swirling animal forms and predatory motifs, reflected a deep connection to the natural world and the hunt. But the Saiyans were far more than wild raiders. They were diplomats, mercenaries, and savvy traders. Especially in dealings with Greek colonies dotting the Black Sea, they exchanged furs, slaves, and grain for imported wine, pottery, and luxurious goods. Greek authors both revered and feared them. Herodotus described their unusual customs, drinking the blood of enemies and using scalps as napkins, yet also commended their sense of justice and fierce loyalty to family clans. Their religious beliefs were primal, animistic, centered on gods of war, fire, and fertility. Rituals ranged from inhaling cannabis smoke to horse sacrifices. Their worldview was cyclical and deeply tied to the land, not through ownership, but through a sacred sense of movement and passage. Eventually, the Saiyans faded into history, surrounded by pressure from rival nomads like the Sarmatians, and hemmed in by expanding empires. They gradually dissolved into the tapestry of time. Still, they set the archetype for the steppe warrior, a mobile, deadly, fiercely independent fighter, with no master and no fixed home. They left no written records, but their legacy is cast every time a mounted archer is silhouetted against the endless steppe horizon. That shadow belongs to the Saiyans, the storm that roared before the rise of empire. while the Assyrians held sway over the vast grassy plains. Far to the south, another people, the Bedouins, etched their story deeply into the shifting desert sands, emerging from the expansive deserts of the Arabian Peninsula. In the vast island of Insula, the Bedouin were far more than mere wanderers. They were masters of survival and ingenious engineers of life in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Unlike the boisterous, mounted thunder of steppe nomads, the Bedouin's existence was quieter, more measured, crafted carefully around the desert's natural rhythms. The ebb and flow of drought and rainfall, grazing routes hidden beneath the sands, and the guiding paths carved by the stars overhead. Their homes were the iconic black goat hair tents, known as beetles, portable, breathable shelters that could be packed with relative ease to move with the people. Life for the Bedouin constantly shifted with the rhythms of their camels, aptly called the ships of the desert. These animals were indispensable, simultaneously serving as transportation, sources of food, clothing materials, and even currency. The Bedouins' social world was famously organized around their tribal clan system. Loyalty to one's kin was paramount. Everything else came second to allegiance within the group. Honor, known as sheriff, was more than just a concept. It functioned as the very social adhesive holding the community together. A single insult could ignite a fierce blood feud, tearing families and tribes apart. Yet, beside this fierce sense of honor stood another sacred virtue: generosity to guests, referred to as karam. Strangers were entitled to food, water, and protection for 3 days without any questions asked. When it came to warfare, the Bedouin favored speed and strategy over brute force. Their conflicts centered on raids, gazu, swift and calculated strikes aimed at capturing goods and livestock with minimal bloodshed. These battles were never about large-scale slaughter. Instead, they were complex affairs tied closely to survival, prestige, and personal honor. Successfully conducting a raid could lift a man's status in the tribe, while failure left a lasting stain on the collective reputation that could haunt generations. Yet, Bedouin life was not consumed by conflict and harsh deserts alone. It thrived with a vibrant oral tradition. Poets held the esteemed role of warriors of words, their verses carrying stories of history, censure against enemies, and praise for heroes. This poetry was preserved not on paper but through memory, often performed in rhythmic, song-like cadences around smoky campfires. Some poems transcended art to become tribal laws. Others evolved into enduring legacies that shaped the Bedouin identity. Trade caravans often traversed the lands of the Bedouin, and these tribesmen filled vital roles as guides, protectors, and occasionally smugglers. They transported precious commodities such as incense, spices, and silk from southern Arabia to the Levant and beyond. Their intimate knowledge of every oasis and every star-guided route was legendary, and commanded great respect and value. Although many Bedouins eventually settled in cities and empires, they maintained a fierce pride in their roots. The black tent and the tribal codes they followed endured as powerful symbols of Bedouin identity. In truth, they were far more than survivors of the desert. They embodied its very soul. Turning our gaze northwards, no nomadic people have reshaped world history quite like the Mongols. In the 13th century, these steppe riders surged forth from the Mongolian plains and forged the largest contiguous land empire ever known. Their origins share the familiar traits of nomadic cultures before them: mobile, clan-based, and astonishingly adaptable. Life on the Mongolian steppe was relentless and unforgiving. The Mongols lived in gurs, circular, felt-covered tents that could be assembled in under an hour and packed onto carts to move by morning. Their survival depended on herds of horses, yaks, and goats, sustaining them in the vast open landscapes. Mongol children grew up in the saddle, learning to ride long before they could read. Indeed, Literacy was rare among them, but knowledge flowed freely through songs, proverbs, and the sharp edges of memory. What truly set the Mongols apart was their ability to weaponize their unparalleled mobility. Under the leadership of Genghis Khan, tribal divisions, the old order was shattered and rebuilt into a fresh merit-based system. Loyalty to one's tribe was replaced by unwavering loyalty to the Khan. And with that fundamental shift, the world as it was known began to change dramatically. Mongol warfare was nothing short of a mesmerizing dance. Swift, cunning, and incredibly coordinated. Their horse archers mastered the art of firing accurately while charging at full gallop. Dorjand. They used feigned retreats to lure enemies into traps, and could cover astonishing distances, sometimes traveling over 100 miles in a single day. But the Mongols were far more than mere raiders. They were brilliant strategists. They employed scouts and spies, utilized signal flags, and executed psychological warfare with terrifying precision and effectiveness. When the Mongols moved from raiding nomadic bands to conquering established cities, they adapted swiftly. Engineers from China and Persia, experts in siege technology, joined their ranks. Learning quickly, the Mongols mastered the construction and use of catapults, flaming arrows, and battering rams, unleashing these weapons with chilling efficiency against fortified cities. Yet here lies the fascinating paradox. They were not just agents of destruction. The Mongol Empire became a powerful force that connected the world in ways never seen before. They revitalized and protected the Silk Road, securing safe passage from China all the way to Europe. Through this vast network, not only goods but ideas and even diseases like the Black Death traveled throughout Eurasia. Under Mongol rule, innovative systems flourished. They introduced paper currency and passport systems, and enforced policies of religious tolerance unheard of in many regions. Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists alike could journey safely within Mongol lands as long as they remained loyal and did not rebel. However, despite ruling sprawling empires, the Mongols remained nomads deep in their essence. Even the greatest of their leaders would return to their tents, tend their herds, and roam the open steppe. They conquered cities, but they never fully belonged to them. No matter how far they expanded, they always rode with the wind at their backs. To sedentary empires, nomads were seen as either useful allies or dangerous foes, and sometimes both simultaneously. But from the nomad's perspective, the boundary between trade and raid was fluid and negotiable. One day, they would escort caravans safely across harsh deserts. The next, they might plunder the very towns along the border. This conduct depended on many factors: the mood of the leaders, the season, or simply how well payment was made. Trade was the lifeblood of nomadic societies. Most nomads could not cultivate grain or create pottery, and so they depended heavily on acquiring crucial tools, textiles, spices, and luxury goods from others. In return, they offered livestock, furs, leather, salt, and exotic items such as falcons or rare horses. Some nomadic groups traded directly with established empires, while others served as vital middlemen linking distant regions. These connections formed essential links along monumental routes like the Silk Road and the Incense Route, enabling the flow of goods across continents. However, these were no mere peaceful merchant caravans. They were well-armed convoys prepared to defend themselves fiercely or attack if the situation demanded. A tribal leader might sit down to negotiate peacefully one week with a neighboring border governor, only to lead a raid on that governor's storehouses the next. Empires called such behavior treachery. The nomads called it having options. Take the example of the Scythians, who traded grain and gold with Greek cities along the Black Sea. If a city dared to cheat them, they returned with fire and destruction. The Bedouins protected precious incense and spice caravans traveling across Arabia, unless a caravan failed to pay protection fees, in which case the camels would promptly change direction. The Mongols themselves under Genghis Khan initially sought peaceful trade relations with the Khwarezmian Empire, but when their merchants were executed, the Mongols responded with complete annihilation of the enemy, unleashing a brutal campaign of retaliation and conquest. In the world of nomads, trade was never just about commerce. It was deeply personal and political. It served as a mirror reflecting respect and status. When sedentary kingdoms treated nomadic tribes as equals, trade flourished. But if these kingdoms showed disrespect, the consequences were swift and often executed from horseback. This fragile balance gave birth to a unique dynamic known as border economies. Towns and cities located on the fringes of nomadic territories became hybrid spaces, part military outpost, part bustling market. Governors often resorted to bribing chieftains, while tribes exchanged not only goods like horses, but also vital news and intelligence. Occasionally, marriages were arranged to cement these delicate peace agreements. Far from being a flaw in their way of life, this oscillation between trade and raid was a deliberate feature. It enabled nomads to negotiate power without the need to conquer or occupy land, influencing empires without building them, and preserving their mobility in a world obsessed with fortified walls. They didn't require the physical conquest of cities. Instead, they ensured that cities always kept an eye on the horizon. In a time without libraries, scrolls, or printing presses, how did nomadic cultures safeguard their histories? Their answer was surprisingly elegant and potent. Through memory. Oral tradition was far more than a means of storytelling. It was their living archive, courtroom, constitution, and mythology all fused into one. Whether on the sea and grasslands, Mongol plains, or Bedouin deserts, this reverence for memory made the spoken word as powerful as any sword. Elders were not merely aged individuals. They were walking archives. They could recount genealogies spanning a dozen generations, relay war stories that defined tribal identities, and recite proverbs that shaped decisions both in peace and conflict. These weren't casual campfire tales for entertainment, but vital lessons, warnings, and laws. Among the Bedouins, poetry held supreme importance. A single well-crafted verse could shame foes, honor heroes fallen in battle, or resolve disputes. Poets, or shai, served as trusted advisors to tribal leaders and were often remembered more vividly than many chiefs. Their words had the power to ignite wars or bring them to an abrupt halt, their memories impeccably preserved. Epic narratives were passed down verbatim through countless generations. The Mongols shared this tradition. Their seminal work, The Secret History of the Mongols, was initially an oral record before being committed to writing. It chronicled not only the rise of Genghis Khan, but also articulated cultural values like loyalty, fate, revenge, and ambition that defined their society. This was no dry historical account. It was a vibrant saga originally recited by heart, designed to educate and unify. Even the Scythians, who left behind almost no written records, preserved detailed oral histories of their migrations, battles, and alliances. When Greek historians like Herodotus described their stories, they were capturing echoes of much older oral traditions. For nomads, history was conveyed around campfires rather than etched in stone. Oral tradition did come with its challenges. Memories could fade, narratives might evolve, yet it also offered monumental advantages. It was alive, adaptable, flexible, and profoundly human. This method enabled nomadic societies to maintain their identity despite migrations, defeats, or cultural absorption, preserving the essence of who they were across time and space. Empires may have crumbled and their records faded into oblivion, but the stories of nomads endured, not in written pages, but carried in breath and memory. As long as someone recalls them, nothing is ever truly lost. In many ancient civilizations, women were often relegated to the shadows, silent, veiled, or confined within palace walls. Yet, among nomadic societies, the narrative was strikingly different. Life on the move meant everyone had a role, and that included women holding substantial power and responsibility. From the Scythians to the Mongols, archaeological and historical findings reveal that nomadic women were far more than just mothers or wives. They were riders, warriors, shamans, diplomats, and clan leaders. The demands of constant mobility left no room for idleness. Every community member, regardless of gender, had to contribute to survival, warfare, and leadership. Consider the Scythians. Burial sites scattered across the Eurasian steppe have uncovered women interred with swords, arrows, and armor, their bones bearing the marks of battle wounds. These were not mere symbolic burials. They fought. The Greeks, both fascinated and alarmed, spun myths about the Amazons, fierce warrior women who were believed to descend from these nomadic tribes. In Mongol society, women managed the camps when men departed for raids or conquests. However, their influence extended far beyond the encampments. At the highest echelons of power, women left indelible marks. Genghis Khan's daughters and daughters-in-law governed territories, led armies, and engaged in diplomatic missions. One of the most formidable Mongol women, Sagakani Beki, was a master strategist and kingmaker who raised emperors and forged alliances. Among the Bedouins, though women held fewer formal leadership positions, their influence was undeniable through poetry, family ties, and the sacred customs of hospitality. A woman's tent was her kingdom, where her skill in managing resources, protecting honor, and nurturing future warriors made her central to tribal life. In some tribes, women could initiate divorce, control property, and even own camels, the ultimate sign of wealth and survival. Spiritual authority also rested strongly with women. In Turkic and Siberian steppe cultures, female shamans played essential roles as healers, spirit guides, and guardians of ancestral traditions. They were not marginal mystics, but respected pillars of their communities. In essence, the demands of nomadic life fostered a greater degree of equality than was typical in many empires of the time. The unpredictable nature of their existence required adaptability. When a man fell in battle, a woman stepped forward without hesitation or formal permission. Within these windswept societies, a woman held the power to both rock the cradle and draw the bow. For nomads, spirituality was never confined to temples or permanent shrines. It was interlaced with the land, the skies, and the very journey itself. With lives in constant motion, their gods were companions on the road. Nomadic belief systems were generally animistic and closely connected to nature. Rooted deeply in the cycles of seasons, the instincts of animals, and the relentless rhythms of survival, the spiritual life of ancient nomads was an intimate conversation with the unseen world. For them, the wind was more than just a force of nature. It was a messenger carrying voices from beyond. Mountains stood as vigilant guardians, rivers flowed as carriers of spirits, and fire burned with sacred meaning. Life itself was a constant dialogue with invisible forces. Take the Scythians, for instance, described by Herodotus. Their worship revolved around a vibrant pantheon tightly woven into the natural world. Titi, the goddess of the hearth, who likely aligns with the Greek Hestia, held a special place in their hearts. Papios, their sky god, watched over them all. Their rituals were visceral and earthy, often involving the sacrifice of horses, the scent of cannabis smoke wafting under open skies, and solemn oaths sworn with the heavens as their witness. There were no priests cloaked in elaborate robes, so only fierce warriors and shamans reaching out to the celestial realm. Similarly, the Bedouins, prior to the rise of Islam, practiced a form of polytheism focused on local gods and tribal idols. Yet, even more significant was their reverence for the unseen, the mysterious currents of fate and nature that shaped their lives. Jinn or spirits were believed to inhabit the rocks, the swirling desert winds, and the most desolate places. Poets and seers were considered vessels, sometimes possessed or inspired by these enigmatic entities. Hospitality transcended mere custom. It was a sacred duty embedded in their spiritual beliefs. The Mongols, too, centered their spirituality on Tangrism, the worship of Tangri, the eternal blue sky. Tangri was not a god confined to temples, but the sky itself, ever-present, watchful, and just. Genghis Khan famously claimed his mandate to rule was granted directly by Tangri. Beyond the sky, the Mongols revered earth spirits, ancestral ghosts, and the sacred fire that burned at the heart of every yurt. Shamanism was indispensable, with shamans serving as healers, guides into the spirit world, and trusted advisors in political affairs. What made nomadic spirituality truly remarkable was its adaptability. As nomadic cultures encountered Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and others, they often blended these beliefs with their own traditions. Mongol emperors famously supported multiple religions simultaneously. A Bedouin might faithfully follow Islamic law while still holding fast to the ancient customs rooted in the desert. Unlike city dwellers who built grand temples to contain the divine, nomads carried their sacred world with them wherever they wandered. Their gods journeyed alongside them, their rituals shifted with the seasons, and their beliefs flowed as freely as the rivers they crossed. For nomads, faith required no walls, just the sky overhead, the earth beneath, and the memories bridging past and present. They left no pyramids, no towering cathedrals, and their capitals have vanished from modern maps. Yet the legacy of these ancient nomadic cultures is etched indelibly across history. In the arteries of trade, the scars left by conquest, and the very languages we speak today, nomads were not mere footnotes. They were powerful agents of change, reshaping entire continents through their relentless movement. The Silk Road, often thought of as merely a route for silk and spices, was in truth a road paved by the hooves of nomadic tribes and sustained by their diplomacy, strength, and intimate local knowledge. Without them, the great cultural exchanges between East and West may never have taken place. Empires feared these mobile warriors for good reason. The Xians, Xiongnu, Turks, and Mongols all shattered the illusion of urban superiority. Their triumphs revealed a profound truth. Mobility can outthink monuments. Where empires anchored themselves in stone, nomads flowed like water, unstoppable and ever adapting. Over time, the nomads adapted with unhurried grace. While cities fortified themselves with towering walls, these wandering peoples depended on their exceptional speed and mobility. Yet, their impact extended far beyond military tactics. As cultural emissaries, they transported music, culinary traditions, stories, and even religious beliefs from one region to another. Consider the Mongol Empire, which introduced Chinese printing technology to Persia, enriching the region's intellectual landscape. The traditions of the Arab Bedouins deeply influenced the early Islamic world, shaping its language, legal codes, poetry, and ideals of honor. Meanwhile, Turkish nomads laid the essential foundations for the rise of the Ottoman Empire. The routes they traversed became vital lifelines of civilization itself. Even after their empires crumbled, the essence of their culture endured. Today, you can witness their legacy in modern horsemanship, in the oral storytelling traditions that prevail, and in the enduring values of kinship, resilience, and independence echoing across the vast steppes, deserts, and tundras. These nomads also serve as a reminder that no human-made structure is truly permanent. not even the grandest of empires. Through their story, we learn that borders are fragile, like shifting winds, and that power need not be etched in stone to be potent. Presently, many nomadic communities still exist, albeit in reduced numbers and increasingly challenged by modern national borders, climate change, and urban expansion. Yet their descendants uphold customs far older than modern nations themselves, offering hospitality to strangers, honoring animals with reverence, and sharing stories passed down through generations, like horses galloping through morning mist. So, when exploring history, don't focus solely on obvious landmarks like walls, temples, and thrones. Look between these monuments. That is where the nomads lived, and it is there that the currents of history truly flowed. Meanwhile, in the mid-1800s, America was a nation divided not merely by political strife, but by geography. The eastern states buzzed with cities, factories, and bustling ports, while the vast western territories sprawled wild, mountains, deserts, and gold fields extending endlessly. Between these extremes lay over 1,700 miles of harsh wilderness. Traveling from New York to California demanded weeks aboard ships navigating the treacherous Cape Horn route, or enduring months of wagon travel fraught with disease, bandits, and choking dust. Yet, despite these obstacles, a dream took hold. A railroad that would stitch the country together, linking coast to coast by steel rails. Though unthinkable to some and inevitable to others, visionaries saw this endeavor as a unifying force for the Republic. Accelerating communication, facilitating troop movements, opening new economic markets, and taming the untamed frontier. However, constructing this transcontinental railroad required more than determination. It needed vast sums of money, a labor force, enormous land allocations, and significant political backing. This political momentum came in the form of the Civil War. In 1862, even as the nation was fractured by conflict, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act. 2. This landmark legislation authorized two companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, to build the railroad from opposite ends. The Union Pacific would push westward from Omaha, Nebraska, while the Central Pacific advanced eastward from Sacramento, California. Their tracks would ultimately meet in the middle. To incentivize construction, the government granted massive land parcels. For every mile of track laid, each company received up to 640 acres of public land alongside generous government loans. Thus, the race was on, not just to unify a divided nation, but to claim land, wealth, and a place in history. On paper, the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad was heralded as a marvel of infrastructure, yet behind the grandeur lay one of the most brutal construction projects in American history. Workers faced the monumental task of blasting through towering mountains, bridging vast southwestern plains, and battling the extremes of bitter winters and scorching desert heat. Thousands of immigrants and laborers were brought in to shoulder this immense burden. The rewards promised were indeed monumental, but so too was the human cost. And for the indigenous nations whose lands the railroad would cut through like a deep scar, this progress was not a blessing but a dire warning. In 1862, the idea of the railroad still seemed like a risky gamble. Yet, within 7 years, two railroad lines would meet deep in the Utah desert, fundamentally altering the landscape and future of America forever. While the Union Pacific's route ahead lay mostly across the flat plains of Nebraska, the Central Pacific confronted a far more daunting challenge right from the start: the Sierra Nevada mountain range. These were no gentle hills, but towering granite peaks subject to deadly avalanches, massive snowdrifts, and terrain so treacherous it was backbreaking to traverse. And all of this took place before the invention of dynamite. Construction began in Sacramento in 1863, but the real obstacle stood just 80 meters to the east: the Sierras themselves, a formidable barricade. Every mile of track laid through this mountain range felt like an epic battle against the forces of nature. To overcome this monumental challenge, the Central Pacific needed a massive labor force. Initially, they hired mostly Irish immigrants and white laborers, but many soon abandoned the project, unable or unwilling to endure the grueling conditions. That led the company to turn to a new workforce, Chinese immigrants. By 1865, more than 10,000 Chinese laborers were hard at work building the railroad, making up over 80% of the Central Pacific's entire workforce. Despite being paid less than their white counterparts and living in more dangerous conditions amidst harsh racism, these workers proved absolutely indispensable, forging ahead with remarkable skill, endurance, and discipline. Their work was both heroic and horrifying. Using only hand tools and black powder, they carved tunnels through solid granite. The most infamous of these, Tunnel Number 6, took nearly 2 years to complete. In winter, snowdrifts reached heights of 40 feet, burying worker camps beneath the heavy snow. Vertical shafts, like chimneys, connected these snow-covered camps, preserving air access. Dozens of workers perished in avalanches, explosions, and rock slides throughout this brutal ordeal. Yet, the railroad line relentlessly advanced. To speed up progress, Chinese crews undertook terrifying tasks, such as suspending themselves in baskets over sheer cliffs to chip away stone inch by inch. When circumventing a mountain was impossible, they went straight through it. If leveling the terrain was unfeasible, they engineered towering wooden trestles that spanned ravines and gulches, demonstrating astonishing ingenuity and bravery in the face of extreme danger. Their labor is among the most perilous and underappreciated in American history. Few records remain honoring individual Chinese workers, and no statues were erected for them at the time. But without their tireless hands, the dream of a transcontinental railroad would have died deep in the Sierra Nevada. By 1867, the Central Pacific finally emerged from the mountains. What lay ahead was not gentle, but another formidable test. Desert, harsh, dry, and deadly terrain stretched before them, but it was mostly flat, meaning the worst challenges were behind. Now, the real race to the meeting point in Utah was truly underway. While the Central Pacific battled granite peaks and relentless snow in the west, the Union Pacific forged its own difficult path to the east. The Union Pacific Railroad began its ambitious journey from Omaha, Nebraska, stretching westward through the sprawling Great Plains, a landscape that seemed endless, flat, and deceptively simple. However, the true obstacles they faced weren't natural but deeply human. People, politics, and the struggle for power. The railroad company hired a diverse workforce, including mainly Irish immigrants, former Union soldiers, and freed African Americans. Many of these men, veterans seeking steady pay after the Civil War, formed the backbone of the labor crews. Remarkably, they could lay down 2, sometimes even 3 miles of track in a single day. The vast open plains allowed for this incredible speed, but they also left the workers vulnerable to raids, starvation, and punishing environmental extremes. This land was not empty. It was the sacred territory of indigenous peoples, the Ponca, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota Sioux, who had hunted, lived, and died on these plains for countless generations. For them, the railroad wasn't a symbol of progress. It was an invasion, a devastating encroachment. The new tracks carved through vital tribal hunting grounds. The smoke belching from engines frightened and scattered buffalo herds, and the telegraph poles and surveyors disrupted sacred sites. These tribes, understanding the full weight of what was arriving, settlers, soldiers, fences, and inevitable displacement, prepared to resist. Leaders like Red Cloud among the Lakota Sioux led fierce opposition. They raided construction camps, attacked surveying teams, and even tore up newly laid rail lines. In response, the U.S. government fortified the railroad's path with newly built forts and stationed troops to protect the workers and the tracks. Construction of the railroad became a militarized campaign, with laborers often working under armed guard. What unfolded was a low-grade war, fought with rifles and broken treaties that never offered lasting peace. For the indigenous peoples, the railroad spelled the end of their traditional way of life, and their fears were tragically accurate. Still, the Union Pacific pressed onward, funded by enormous federal loans and driven by businessmen like Thomas Durant. The company pushed its crews to lay track with breathtaking speed. Workers lived in makeshift towns, dubbed Hell on Wheels, which sprang up overnight and vanished just as quickly. These transient settlements were hubs of gambling, whiskey, and violence, shadowing the laborers like relentless dust storms. By 1867, the railroad had reached Cheyenne, moving steadily into Wyoming. The mountains loomed ahead, formidable and majestic, but the greatest barrier was political and moral rather than geological. How do you unite a nation by laying rails across the graves of another? For the Union Pacific leaders, the answer was unwavering: keep laying track and never look back. The popular narrative of the Transcontinental Railroad, with its golden spikes and dignified men in top hats, often glosses over the true texture of this epic endeavor. The real story is soaked in sweat, muscle, and pain, much of it endured by countless men whose names were never recorded, whose graves remain unmarked, and whose stories lie buried beneath the very rails they helped lay. On the Central Pacific side of the project, it was the Chinese laborers who achieved the extraordinary. Nearly 15,000 Chinese immigrants, most from Guangdong province, braved freezing winter winds, deadly explosions, and intense racial hostility as they tunneled through the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains. They earned significantly less than their white counterparts, received no recognition, and were forced into segregated inferior living camps. Yet, they persisted with quiet skill and relentless determination, playing an indispensable role in the railroad's completion. Despite the immense challenges and discrimination they faced, initially underestimated and deemed weak and unfit by early critics, the Chinese crews quickly demonstrated they were the most dependable workforce on the railroad. They blasted through rock, laid down rails, built sturdy trestles, and even cooked their own meals, often maintaining better health than their fellow workers. Yet, when the momentous final spike was driven at Promontory Point, none of these Chinese laborers were invited to be part of the iconic photo commemorating the event. Meanwhile, on the Union Pacific side, Irish immigrants constituted a substantial portion of the labor force. Many of them had endured famine and war, only to confront new perils across the plains. They defended against raids, laid track at an incredible pace, and ended long days by drinking themselves to sleep in fragile, makeshift tents. Their existence was harsh, but their labor was absolutely critical to the railroad's completion. Freed African American men also contributed significantly, many hired as freedmen pursuing better opportunities. Sadly, like their Chinese and Irish counterparts, their vital contributions were largely unacknowledged. Laborers of color were both exploited and indispensable. This multinational workforce was laboring with bare hands and broken backs, physically crafting a nation. Alongside these track layers were the cooks, blacksmiths, teamsters, and supply haulers, each one playing an essential role in keeping the colossal machinery of progress on the move. None of these men held executive titles, yet without their sweat and toil, there simply would have been no golden spike. The grand American mythology tends to spotlight visionaries and tycoons, but railroads were never built by dreams alone. They were forged by calloused hands, underpaid laborers, and marginalized workers. People who shaped history without any promise their names would be remembered. They didn't build the railroad for fame or glory. They built it to survive. By the late 1860s, the two railroad companies, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific, were no longer merely constructing tracks. They were engaged in a frenzied, cutthroat competition, each racing towards an unseen meeting point in the Utah Territory. This was not a civil contest, but a fierce battle for land, money, and prestige. What drove this urgency? The government subsidies that rewarded each company with federal land grants and generous loans for every mile of track completed. The more track you laid, the greater your profit. Naturally, both sides sought to outbuild each other, at times laying parallel tracks heading in opposite directions, fully aware that only one would ultimately be used. The rivalry soon took on absurd proportions. Crews labored at breakneck speeds. The Central Pacific, fresh from conquering the Sierra Nevada, now blasted through the harsh Nevada and Utah deserts. Simultaneously, the Union Pacific pushed through rivers and high plains, skirting the Rockies' edge, often building track where the government was likely to later declare the land worthless, just to secure funding. Work intensified to nearly manic levels. In April 1869, the Central Pacific's Chinese crews set a world record by laying 10 miles of track in a single day, a remarkable feat, unmatched even today. This astonishing achievement was made possible by highly organized, synchronized teams working in rotating shifts and a rhythm perfected over years of labor. The Union Pacific crews, determined not to be outdone, also pushed relentlessly from their end. Despite facing relentless labor strikes, persistent supply shortages, and poor management from their financier Thomas Durant, who was more preoccupied with stock manipulation than the actual engineering of the railroad, the two rail lines finally approached each other at Promontory Summit in what is today Utah. Surveyors marked the precise spot, and preparations were underway for a grand, formal ceremony. Locomotives from both competing companies, the Central Pacific's Jupiter and the Union Pacific's number 119, were positioned nose to nose, their cowcatchers nearly touching. Executives busied themselves crafting speeches, and a special golden spike was commissioned for the historic occasion. Telegraph wires were connected so that every hammer strike driving the spike could be transmitted instantly across the country, allowing the entire nation to witness the moment in real time. Yet, beneath this festive occasion lay a harsher truth. The race to join the rails had been fierce and often reckless, fueled strictly by the promise of profit. Although the tracks now formed one continuous line, the fierce competition had left scars. On the land, on the laborers who made it possible, and on countless lives. Progress demanded crossing a finish line, and both companies showed a willingness to trample anything or anyone to arrive there first. On May 10, 1869, a gusty plain at Promontory Summit, Utah, became the focus of the entire American nation. A diverse crowd gathered, workers, officials, journalists, and railroad executives, all witnessing the moment the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads were joined, completing the monumental Transcontinental Railroad. Gleaming and proud, the two locomotives, the Jupiter from the Central Pacific and the number 119 from the Union Pacific, stood face to face on the finished track. Between them lay a final rail, centered by a golden spike engraved with the sentiment, "May God continue the unity of our country as this railroad unites the two great oceans of the world." Telegraph lines connected directly to the ceremonial hammer ensured the final strikes would electrify the nation. As Leland Stanford, representing the Central Pacific, swung the sledgehammer, Americans coast to coast paused in anticipation. Each strike triggered a telegraph click, and with the final blow, city bells rang out, cannons fired, and celebrations erupted everywhere. From New York to San Francisco, it felt as if the country's lifeblood, its rail arteries, had been stitched together in real time. The vast distances that once kept east and west months apart were now bridged by a journey of only 7 days. This spectacle was more than an engineering marvel. It was a symbol of the young, post-Civil War nation's resolve. It proved that a once fractured land could be physically and symbolically united, stepping boldly into the modern industrial era. But the celebration glossed over uncomfortable truths. The Chinese workers, who had laid the majority of the Central Pacific's track under grueling conditions, were completely absent from the official photographs and the ceremony itself. Alongside them, Irish laborers, freedmen, native guides, and other marginalized groups shared no part in the formal recognition. Instead, the staged images showed only bearded men in frock coats wielding hammers and cigars, the faces of power and privilege. So while America celebrated unity and progress, the reality was far more complex. The railroad did connect the continent, but the human cost and social inequities it concealed ran deep and would echo for generations to come. The Transcontinental Railroad stretched from east to west, weaving together markets, but also deepening the divides among races, classes, and cultures. This vast network connected distant cities, but it came at the high cost of countless human lives. That iconic photograph from the railroad's completion day tells the official tale, a story of triumph and progress. Yet, beneath the gleaming tracks lay a far more complex and often painful truth. The completion of the railroad did more than shrink distances. It ignited the American economy like never before. Almost instantly, the United States transformed from a divided bi-coastal nation, struggling with the wilderness in between, into a unified, thriving economic entity. Goods that once took months to traverse the continent by wagon or ship now sped coast to coast in less than a week. Agricultural products from the Midwest, wheat, corn, and cattle, flowed westward, feeding mining towns that were bursting with opportunity. In return, manufactured goods surged eastward, keeping industry humming. The days of ox-drawn wagons gave way to rolling rail cars. Steam engines replaced sailing ships. The uncertain frontier became a lucrative supply chain, feeding an interconnected web of commerce. New towns bloomed along the railroad like wildflowers after spring rain. These railroad towns sprang up almost overnight. Some blossomed into cities, while others vanished just as quickly if their rail connections shifted. Each community became a vital link in a growing network, alive to the steady rhythm of pistons churning, whistles blowing, and smoke rising into the sky. The railroad also powered industrial growth on an unprecedented scale. Ironworks thrived, coal mines proliferated, and timber mills grew busier than ever, all fueled by surging demand. The need for rails, locomotives, and sprawling infrastructure created thousands of jobs across the country. Steel magnates and railroad tycoons amassed vast fortunes, bankers fattened their pockets, and small entrepreneurs seized new opportunities, opening hotels, eateries, and general stores alongside the tracks. Communication transformed too. Mail sped across the continent, and news that once took weeks now traveled in mere days, shrinking time zones. For the first time, the federal government could project real authority from coast to coast, deploying troops, resources, and political influence wherever rails reached. Millions of people heeded the call westward. Immigrants arriving at New York saw a clear path to new opportunities in California, Oregon, and the Western Territories. Homesteaders, prospectors, ranchers, and even outlaws all shared the steel ribbon, stretching across the land, each chasing their own version of destiny. However, this boom masked harsh realities. Wealth flowed primarily upward. Native lands were seized and destroyed, and laborers often toiled in poverty. Yet, undeniably, the railroad transformed the United States from a regional republic into a continental powerhouse. The engine moved more than people. It carried money, power, and the promise of the future. Once set in motion, it was unstoppable. Beneath the shining rails and triumphant headlines lay a darker, more tragic story. The railroad carved a violent path through indigenous lands, disrupting the lives and cultures of the Lakota, Cheyenne, Shoshone, Ute, and many others. What had been open plains and sacred ground was forever changed, marking a profound and painful chapter in America's story. The landscape was carved up by rails, telegraph poles, and fencing, each spike hammered into the ground, marking a gradual erosion of native sovereignty. The consequences were swift and devastating. Immense buffalo herds, vital to the lives of the Plains tribes, central to their economies, diets, and spiritual practices, were mercilessly slaughtered to make way for trains and settlers. Passengers were sometimes even encouraged to hunt buffalo for sport, right from moving trains. Once numbering in the tens of millions, these majestic herds plummeted to near extinction within just a few decades. But the railroad wasn't simply about tracks. It was a vector for settlers, soldiers, and surveyors. New towns emerged where none had existed before. Homesteaders, supported by federal mandates, staked claims on lands once belonging to tribes, often claims that treaties hadn't ceded. The railroad rapidly consumed vast stretches of tribal land, and with settlers came a military presence, garrisons deployed to safeguard the rails and suppress any form of resistance. Confrontations ignited. The Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and other tribes mounted fierce resistance, engaging in a series of bloody conflicts. Some of these skirmishes have been termed uprisings, others outright massacres. From Red Cloud's War to the infamous Battle of Little Bighorn, the railroads became both contested battlegrounds and coveted prizes. Despite fierce opposition, the resistance was overwhelmed. Indigenous peoples were confined to reservations, frequently located hundreds of miles from their ancestral territories. The psychological scars run deep. Sacred sites were defiled, hunting patterns shattered. Cultures that thrived on nomadic seasonal migrations were forced into fixed, surveilled settlements. All of this was rationalized in the name of progress. The Transcontinental Railroad was celebrated as a triumph of American innovation, but it came at the profound cost of the dreams of countless native nations. It wasn't just iron rail slicing through the land. It was the erasure of a way of life, replaced by tracks and timbers. History books often herald the railroad for knitting the nation together. But for native peoples, it tore their world apart. When the final spike was driven at Promontory Summit in 1869, it marked not just the completion of a railway, but the dawn of a new American identity, faster, hungrier, and increasingly defined by steel and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad shrunk the vast country. What had taken 6 months by wagon or ship now took only 7 days by rail. It transformed how people moved, how goods were exchanged, and how distance was perceived. Suddenly, the idea of a nation stretching from coast to coast ceased to be a distant dream and became daily reality. The railroad prompted the establishment of time zones to coordinate nationwide travel and commerce. It revolutionized agriculture by enabling farmers to ship produce across state lines easily. It powered the Second Industrial Revolution, allowing raw materials to flow seamlessly into urban factories. The entire rhythm of the country began to echo the steady clatter of trains. Culturally, the railroad reinforced the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to span from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Expansion was no longer just possible. It was inevitable. As rails stretched across the continent, they wove together a fast-changing nation, forever altering the landscape and its peoples. Across deserts, mountains, and plains, the wild frontier disappeared, replaced by a sense that everything was within reach and open to claim. The railroad didn't just physically connect the vast lands. It also laid the groundwork for corporate dominance in America. Enormous fortunes were amassed at the top. Figures like Leland Stanford, Thomas Durant, and Collis Huntington weren't merely wealthy. They shaped national policy, influenced politicians, and built sprawling empires. Scandals such as the Credit Mobilia affair revealed just how deeply railroad interests had seeped into government corridors. For the laborers laying tracks, the railroad represented both promise and exploitation. For indigenous peoples, it marked the devastation of their way of life. Environmentally, it triggered sweeping transformations. Forests were cleared, rivers bridged, and buffalo populations were pushed to the brink of extinction. Yet, despite its profound costs, the railroad undeniably wove together the fabric of a modern America. It bridged immigrants to new possibilities, linked businesses to distant markets, and connected governments to far-flung territories. What began as an experimental republic grew into a fully integrated nation. The iron rails carried more than passengers. They bore the weight of ambition, destruction, hope, and hubris. The story of the railroad is at once a tale of triumph and tragedy. When those twin locomotives finally met in the Utah desert, the country changed forever, transformed not through war or elections, but through the relentless force of iron and fire.